Hi, everyone. We're delighted to have Luis here to present his talk of Wheelmen, the New Woman, and the Good Roads, Bicycling in Vermont. Luis is a cultural anthropologist and the co-director of UVM's Humanities Center. Luis will explore in this talk today the fascinating early history of the bicycle in Vermont that was an invention that generated widespread curiosity when it arrived here in the 1880s. He has published several books, starting first with these lovely comic books. Also, a book that's kind of related to the talk today, calling "Reconsidering the Bicycle: An Anthropological Perspective on the New Old Thing." Green Encounters: Shaping the Contesting Environmentalism in Rural Costa Rica. And Tarzan Was an Ecotourist and Other Tales of Anthropology of Adventure. We thank again the Slate Valley Trails, who are co-sponsoring today's talk, and for the additional funding from the Vermont Humanities Council. So will you please join us in welcoming Luis?
Thank you all. I'm very pleased to be here in a crowd of my two sort of favorite types of people, bicycle riders and historically interested people. I'm going to come in front here if you don't mind. How's that? Okay. So I am a cultural anthropologist, and for about 10 years or so I've been doing ethnographic fieldwork on the Renaissance in urban bike riding. And so I've been doing field work in cities like Bogota, Colombia, Copenhagen, Denmark, and Burlington, Vermont. And I'm really interested in what are the prospects that the bicycle brings to connecting green ideas around sustainability and transportation systems. And so I've long studied activists. My early work was studying environmental activists in Costa Rica and in Mexico. And so lately I've been very interested in what are activists around the bicycle doing to remake how we get around. And so I wrote a book, as Krista mentioned, called Reconsidering the Bicycle: An Anthropological Perspective on a New Old Thing. It was one of those delightful moments in my career and life when I realized that no other anthropologist had actually ever really looked seriously and in depth at the bicycle. So I thought, all right, it's wide open territory. So I did field work in Burlington, and I wrote about it in this book. And at the back of my head, when I started that field work, I knew that Burlington had experienced the first bicycle boom in the 1880s and especially the 1890s. And I didn't know much about it, but being a good anthropologist, I wanted to make sure I understood that historical background. And so I started asking around, and if any of you know Burlington, we have a wonderful bike shop called the Old Spokes Home. And the former owner of it is a bike history buff and collects amazing old bicycles. And he had pieced together little bits, and so I had to do something that I didn't expect to do, which was to go into archives and start looking into the history of bicycles in Burlington. So I was looking at digital newspaper collections, I was looking at city directories, I was looking at reports published by the Board of Aldermen, looking at photos and ephemera and all kinds of stuff at UVM. And about a very small fraction of it made it into this book, but it was such a fascinating story, and nobody had told it. So I decided that I needed to tell it. And so I developed this talk and then have expanded over about 8 years or so the talk to be a Vermont-wide talk. And so what I want to talk about today is the history of the bicycle in its early years here, and how it was both a delightful and threatening object to all kinds of sensibilities. And I can assure you, you don't have to be a bike nut to enjoy this. As an anthropologist, I think of the bicycle as a lens into social transformation and what people were debating about and what concerns they brought to a period in American history, especially here in Vermont, that was transforming people's everyday lives. The rise of tourism here in the state, mass migration out of the state, and suddenly these bikes enter the mix and really begin to upend a lot and create new opportunities for all kinds of things, as you're going to see. So the first evidence we have of bicycles in Vermont happens probably around 1869. And there's a report in a newspaper of a velocipede fever raging in Montpelier. And up in St. Albans, there are bicycle races on velocipedes. Now, a velocipede was a very heavy and difficult object, which was also known as a bone shaker. So I have to give you a brief overview of the history of bicycles. So the very first object that we think became the bicycle was a running machine that was invented around 1814, 1815 by a German nobleman named von Drees. And he had long dreamt of a horseless carriage. And then there was the great year without summer because of a volcano that erupted in Indonesia. And it happened here in Vermont. There was, harvests were failing. And this German nobleman saw these horses dying. And he says, my moment has come. And so he invents a sort of horse replacement. And it's two wagon wheels and a sort of wood peak connecting them. It doesn't really steer very well, but you straddle it and you run. And it had no brakes. It really didn't steer very well. You just hoped for the best if you were going down a hill. And they were known as dandy chargers. And they became quite a sensation in Paris and in New York and London and so on. But they kind of went up and down for much of the 19th century. And then in the 1860s, one of these old broken down running machines ended up in a Paris wagon wheel shop. And a young mechanic there, Pierre Lallemand, decided to put some cranks and pedals on that front wheel, see what would happen. And he invented what became called the velocipede. And those were the very first bikes that we started seeing here in Vermont. They were very rare, and they weighed about 150 pounds, and they were two wagon wheels. And they called them bone shakers because they were, when you would ride on roads, they would just be shaking all over. They were quickly banned in New York City, and circuses took to them. So my bet is that we probably had some circuses come to Vermont, which got people excited. So, in order to go faster, and by the way, I'm sorry if you can't see this, but there's an image of a velocipede riding school in St. Albans that was opened in 1869 in the Darrow Hall. And then people wanted to go faster. So what they did was the way you make a direct drive vehicle like that go faster is you build that front wheel, make it bigger and bigger and bigger. But it gets heavier and heavier and heavier. And so this is a great moment of innovation in this just nascent bicycle workshops. You can't even call it an industry yet. When we have the creation of spoked wheels, held together by tension, and that front wheel grows big, big, big. And so this happens in the second half of the 1870s. And those bicycles really do start showing up here in Vermont. And here's an image of Cornell Ross, Nellie Ross, he was known, from Rutland. He was once general manager of the Lincoln Iron Works there. And he was the captain of the Rutland Wheel Club, of which he's a star in this comic, the Lessons Learned comic. So you'll have to look at that. Well, in any case, these individuals who bought these big high wheels, they were called, or penny farthings, you might know them as, they organized wheelmen's clubs. They rode in formation. They, as you might be able to see if you get up close, they wore uniforms. They had a kind of military style organization with a bugler and captain. He was the captain of his club. And they would parade all over the territory. And I wouldn't have been surprised at all if the Rutland Wheel Club paraded right through here in Poultney, being so close. Bicycles were very expensive. They were 6 months' wages at the time for the typical worker. So these tended to be elite men. A few wagon shops and toy manufacturers started creating bicycles a bit like this. But that's the 1870s and the 1880s. Something happens in the 1890s where the bicycle explodes. And bicycles, first of all, become safer because that big front wheel was quite literally a killer. The term header, of flying over your handlebars and landing on your head, came about at that time because it was not an uncommon thing for a rider to hit a rock and land on his head, in many cases dying. And so one of the early inventors of the high wheel in the mid-1880s invented what he called the safety bicycle, which is pretty familiar to all of us today. It's two equally sized wheels with a chain drive. And pretty early on, the bicycle as we know it took on a form that made it a lot safer and more accessible to a lot of people, among them women. And so in the 1890s, we started seeing women joining in on the bicycling craze that was emerging. It was less about elite men who could afford these things and more middle class and middle class aspirant groups started buying bicycles. And a lot of that was because bicycles became cheaper. At the turn of this, or in the 1890s, the bicycle industry was considered to be one of the most prestigious and innovative industries in this country. It was taking that New England tradition of fine precision manufacturing and making these new objects that were luxury objects. They were expensive, but people really aspired to these bicycles. So that first bicycle boom lasted throughout the 1890s into the first years of the 20th century. And by 1910, 1920, it had petered out. The thing is, the bicycle was not just a fad. The bicycle was a precipitator and a consequential protagonist in really important changes that happened. One of the things was the experience that we all enjoy and take for granted today, which is automobility. If you imagine how did people get around, it was by horse and cart, or it was by train, and you didn't have by foot, obviously. You didn't have complete control over that horse. You certainly had no control over the train schedules, and people often thought of trains as swallowing them up. And the bicycle comes along and you can kind of direct it and test your body and go in almost any direction you want. And early bicycle riders did. And so they enjoyed effortless speed. They enjoyed that ability to just sort of direct wherever you want to go. And it's an experience that the automobile sort of, the romance of the open road takes over eventually. But the other thing the bicycle did in a really important way was it laid the groundwork, the technological groundwork, the legal groundwork for the emergence of the automobile. So all of the early bicycle creators were tinkerers, and they started putting engines on these things in the 1880s, as early as that. The internal combustion engine in the second half of the 1880s was already being attached to two-wheel vehicles. And so the automobile industry emerges out of the bicycle industry, and important figures like Henry Ford started their careers as bicycle mechanics. And one of the interesting things about Henry Ford is that as a bicycle mechanic, he visited the Hartford, Connecticut factory of the Columbia Bicycle Company, which had been electrified by Thomas Edison to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, producing bicycles. So and it was in a assembly line fashion. So Ford, obviously it captured his imagination. He made refinements on that assembly line approach, but he learned all that from the bicycle industry. So it was a real cutting edge industry. Ball bearings, the bending of steel tubing, all kinds of technological innovation came out of it. Women started challenging the restrictive clothing that they had to wear first, and then they connected it to the suffrage movement for rights. So the bicycle became an important symbol of women's emancipation. And people were using bikes in ways that challenged their bodies, creating new ideas of athleticism, new challenges of what can you climb, how fast can you go? And the bike became a tool of landscape appreciation. And so Vermont was a destination as early as the 1880s for wheelmen from other states. And so it's the very beginnings of tourism is wrapped up in bicycle riding. So all of these things have important consequential changes for us today. And then another thing that happens is that, I'm sorry you can't see this, but you'll probably get a kick out of some of the things on here, is that there's a whole business that emerges around the bicycle that has to convince people to spend a lot of money on these objects. And in Burlington in the 1890s, for example, there were 10 retailers of bicycles. Now today we have 4, and we have double the population. So there was clearly a huge demand for bicycles, and the way people learned about bicycles was through newspapers. Vermonters were great readers of newspapers. And there were a lot of ads, and about 10% of the ads in the 1890s were bicycle ads. And they had all kinds of interesting techniques to persuade people to come in to lay down probably what would be the equivalent of $2,000 to $3,000 today to get a bicycle. So, and everybody got in on the act. So this is some of the different players in Burlington, a hardware store, George Hager, the hardware store. L.M. March, who was a jeweler selling diamonds, watches, jewelry, optical goods, and bicycles. There was one fully dedicated bike shop in Burlington called Lane's Bicycle Livery, and they rented bicycles. So you could come as a short-term visitor and rent a bicycle for however long you needed it. And E.H. Vancor, an electrician who had a bicycle department in his electrical supply store. And it was such a mania. Again, I'm sorry you can't see this. You can see these afterwards, but this is a famous comic from the 1890s, and the caption says, "The latest disease, bicycle mania, we all have it." And there's all these people here, and they're all either sitting on bicycles, they seem to be interacting with each other around bicycles, and behind them are all these businesses that have been reimagined and reframed as bicycle-related businesses because everybody knew the excitement of the bicycle, so they wanted to latch on their own product to it. So there's bicycle cigars, eat bicycle food, bicycle complexion powders, bicycle boots, drink bicycle soda. All of these things are in here. Cures bicyclist diseases. I will get to that in a little bit, but there were a lot of diseases associated with bicycling. So it was this real mania. It caught people's imagination, and Vermont did not at all stand outside of that. So what I'm going to do today for the remainder is talk to you about what was that mania like in Vermont. Where would you get a bicycle, first of all? Where would you ride it? Who was riding their bicycles? What were the roads like? In 1886, the Rutland Herald said it was not obvious that the bicycle would take hold in Vermont, given its terrible roads and its long winters. But it did. So the talk is divided into sort of 3 brief sections. The Wheelmen, I want to talk about these clubs and the men who brought bicycles here. The New Woman, the bicycle became wrapped up tightly with Vermont's debates over suffrage, and Good Roads, which was a movement that emerged thanks to bicycle riders who got really concerned about unleashing political pressure to improve roads. So the Wheelmen, here's an image of the Bicycle Club of Swanton in 1893. Wheelmen were living at a time when it was important to join civic organizations. Fraternal organizations were an important part of American life in the second half of the 20th century, the 19th century. Hunting clubs and card clubs and so on. And so when the bicycles first emerged, it was thought appropriate to organize your bicycle riding with others. And in fact, wheelmen brought a certain sensibility to their riding. They thought of it as a social activity. You didn't do it alone. It was an orderly activity. You had to do it according to certain kinds of patterns and rules. And it was a leisurely activity. It was meant for recreation. And the very first wheelmen clubs appear in about 1881. Just down the road in Brattleboro, the Vermont Wheel Club gets established in 1881. And it lasts until 1924. And the Vermont Wheel Club was a central organization in Brattleboro that was more than a bike club. They organized all kinds of activities, minstrel shows. They had a baseball team as well. They did all kinds of sort of community events for decades. And in fact, with the first 20 years of that club, you had to have a bicycle to join. But after that, they started admitting men who did not have bicycles. As long as they were, quote unquote, good, upstanding citizens, they could join. And the Vermont Wheel Club was sort of the entry point for a lot of tours from southern New England, where the bike craze took off in Boston and New York. They would come up through Brattleboro. Also, much of the bicycle industry was in the lower Connecticut Valley, and so Brattleboro was connected commercially and so on. So people would come up through the state, through Brattleboro, and they would always stop at the Vermont Wheel Club to be feted, to stay there. They had a very luxurious wheel club house. And so the wheelmen's clubs were elite. They were expensive to be members of. They tended to not include anyone who was not the most wealthy and upstanding citizen in the early years. And the image to the right is the Burlington Wheel Club, taken about 1886. And I know more or less who those individuals in that photo are. And they include the publisher of the Burlington Free Press. They include very prominent doctors and lawyers. And one of the things that being associated with a bicycle did at this time was it gave you tremendous social status because it was so expensive and it was so hard to learn how to ride it. So these were all very high status people seeking to get their status even higher by being in the Burlington Wheel Club. The very next year, the Burlington Wheel Club disbands because they all joined the Lake Champlain Yacht Club, because it seems that this real status lay in getting a yacht and not riding a bicycle. That's the early wheelmen. Here's the president, Joseph Auld. He was the publisher of the Burlington Free Press. He was I guess you could say a Renaissance man of sorts. He published a well-known book called Picturesque Burlington, and there's an image of a map from it. And it was early tourism to Burlington. It was kind of a guidebook of sorts, and it was very much created with his sensibilities that he developed as a wheelman, which is scenic appreciation. Look for the best views, look for the best roads. And he doesn't mention bicycling much in that book, but it's very much shaped by how he saw the world. And then he was also an inventor of sorts, and he got 2 patents, and one of them was for a tricycle gearing system. In 1883. So very early on, he's tinkering, like so many other people were tinkering with their bicycles. And tricycles were a thing, but they didn't have the prestige that riding one of the high-wheelers did, because the high-wheelers were just way more difficult. So if you were going to be sporty, you did not ride a tricycle. But in any case, Auld was never commercialized his patent. Rutland had a bicycle club, and as you saw, Cornell Ross was in it, and my little comic here is a little bit about the Rutland Bicycle Club. I won't ruin the story for you. You have to read the comic. But they had a skating rink. Early wheelmen were very closely associated with skating rinks, because they offered a year-round place to practice tricks and to ride your bike. And you could maybe make some money by renting it out for roller skating or for concerts. And the Rutland Wheel Club opened one on July 4th, 1884. It cost them $15,000 to build, which was very expensive at the time. If you can imagine this was a huge skating rink. It had 1,200 seats. It had gas jet chandeliers. And in 1885, the club declared insolvency, and they sold the rink at auction for $2,325. It was a huge disaster financially for them. Meanwhile, up in Burlington, the Burlington Wheel Club had a skating rink as well, and they would, in the winter months, they would have bicycle riding classes, because nobody knew how to ride these things. So if you got a new bicycle, you could go learn. Not far from here, other side of the mountains, is Bellows Falls, and the Mount Kilburn Wheel Club was a very prominent organization in Bellows Falls. And this is a picture of the kinds of things they did. So these were more than bicycle riding organizations. They were at the social heart of the community. And the Mount Kilburn Wheel Club would sponsor comic operas and plays, concerts, and balls. In fact, they claimed that their winter ball was the social event of the season. It's fair to say that the Vermont Wheel Club's their ball, winter ball, was not just the social event for the state of Vermont, but a political event. If you were an aspiring political figure, you would trek your way down to Brattleboro for the Vermont Wheel Club winter ball, because that's where you made the right kinds of connections you needed to meet your political aspirations. Back to Mount Kilburn, they had a ladies' night, and they had mock trials. So they had a lawyer who was the head of president of their club, and he really loved to engage in bicycle law issues and so on. I'll talk a little bit about that later. But one of the things he organized were these mock trials, and this little ad here is for one where they're trying for the larceny of a rooster. And the idea was that you could show ladies in particular how a legal procedure takes place. So wheelmen's clubs did lots of things beyond the bicycle. Over in the Upper Valley, there was a real concentration of wheelmen. Here's the Woodstock Wheelmen in 1889. There were clubs beyond Woodstock, Hartford, White River Junction, Lebanon, Claremont, Windsor. And they would parade a lot over there throughout the 1890s in particular. And a parade might draw as many as 500 bicycle riders. And I'm going to read for you this little tidbit of a bicycle parade at Woodstock that happened in 1895, just to give you a taste of what was happening. A bicycle meet and parade under the auspices of the Wabeno Cycle Club was held at Woodstock last Friday afternoon and evening, and was a brilliant and successful affair. Stores and residences were elaborately decorated, and in the evening the entire village was beautifully illuminated by over 3,000 Japanese lanterns. The Hartford and Lebanon cycle clubs and cyclists from adjoining towns were present, the Woodstock Railway Company running a special tram. About 200 wheels were in line, and the parade was witnessed by several thousand people. There was a fine display of fireworks in the evening. Woodstock cornet band discoursed music, and refreshments were served to all cyclists and visiting friends in the town hall. So these were the biggest events in any small town, was when the bicycle club would organize a parade and bring in bike riders from elsewhere. And they mostly got there by train. And so some of you cyclists probably know about and maybe were involved in the advocacy to get Amtrak to allow us to put bicycles on our trains from Vermont. We succeeded in that about, 5 years ago now. They were doing that back then. They pressured the railroads to allow bicycles to go on the trains, and they even brought before the legislature a bill that would prevent railroads from charging to put a bicycle on a train. They didn't succeed, but you can see that you'll see this over and over again today. Some of the things that we worry about today with bicycles were already being worked out or worked through or challenged back then. We're still in Woodstock. This is an image of James Murdoch's house. I ran across this a few years ago. It's around 1900. It's nondescript. He was a pharmacist in town. But when you look at that photo more carefully, what you see is a very strange bicycle in the background. And that bicycle had an interesting association with Woodstock. So this bicycle is called a Star Rider. And if you remember, I was talking about the high wheels, so dangerous. Between the high wheel and before the safety bicycle, the Star Rider was created. And the Star Rider just reversed the position of the wheels. The big wheel went in the back and a small wheel went in the front. And between 1884 and 1886, these were the bee's knees. These were the best bicycles you could possibly buy. They were very fast, and all kinds of speed records were created. And a guy named Hazlitt took one to the very top of Mount Washington and rode it down. They were very stable. As you can see here, there was a song that was created about the Star Rider. That's the music on the left. And then the sort of Tiger Woods of his era was a guy named John Stout, who was a deaf mute, who here he's pictured riding down the Michigan State Capitol steps on a Star Rider to show how stable it is. He was a trick rider who was very, very famous during the period. In any case, the Star Rider was manufactured in a place called Smithville, New Jersey. And Smithville was founded by a guy who was from Woodstock, a guy named John Smith, who got into the business of creating wood processing tools, right, and machinery back in Woodstock. And his ambitions were so great that he knew that if he did that in Woodstock, he wouldn't get as far as he wanted. And so he went to New Jersey and he bought a township, renamed it Smithville. And the designer of the Star Rider was so impressed by his manufacturing facilities there that he asked, could you create a bicycle? And so Smith got involved in the bike business for a while. And as I say, it was associated with one of the most prestigious bikes you could own. Bicycles were made in Vermont. This was not a big industrial center, but actually in Rutledge, the Coolidge Cycle Company was creating two models. One was called the Rutland and one was called the Vermont. I'm always looking on eBay to see if any of these things ever emerge. Down in Bennington, the Bennington Bicycle Company created a couple of models. One was called the Tiffany Special and one was called the Nelson Special. One of those did show up on eBay a couple of years ago. It was pretty beaten up. And up in St. Johnsbury, there was a guy who had what he called, G.H. Payne, who had what he called a bicycle hospital, where he was producing new bicycles. But this was off the beaten path, industrially speaking, of the bike industry. So most of these bikes were small production. What about around here? So the Poultney Journal must have had an editor who was a wheelman, because there are so many stories about bicycling during the 1880s and 1890s in the Poultney Journal. Something I don't know if you knew this, but we all have access to the newspapers of record for the state of Vermont through this the state records association, basically the archivists, and it's free access, and you can go dig into your own town's newspaper. And so not digging into Poultney, a few years ago I started noticing Poultney kept on showing up, so clearly there was fascination with bicycling around here. I haven't yet figured out if there was a wheel club in Poultney, but there were clubs in this area. Aside from Rutland, there was a club in Castleton and Fairhaven, West Paulet, Granville. So that's your task, is figure out, was there a wheel club here? And if you wanted a bike here in town, you would go to M.J. Horton and Son. They were a Columbia bicycle dealer, which was kind of a risky thing. Columbia was... they didn't allow you to discount because they wanted to keep value in their bicycles. They were known as very prestigious bicycles. So you were competing against others. And in a town like Poultney, you might have 5 or 6 bicycle agents. And so being a Columbia dealer, you were hoping that people went for the best, but you couldn't discount, because if you did, you would lose your contract, your franchising contract. So Wheelmen really promoted orderly riding. As I said, they had a lot of rules. And so the newspapers were full of advice from wheelmen about how to ride. Always keep to the right, always keep your wheel clean. In passing another rider or vehicle, keep to the right. People had to figure that out. These were new norms. No one really, there were certain patterns already in place, but a typical road might have people passing each other on all sides. Bicycles were moving fast, and so there was a lot of concern about where they were going to go. Keep off crowded streets unless you have urgent business there. Don't forget that pedestrians have rights. It often saves bitter thoughts. And so they're working out etiquette. And I'll read this because I think it's really fascinating and funny. This is from Bradford, the United Opinion, in 1895. It's a little article called Cycling Etiquette. Every sport has its rules of etiquette, and a system of exchange of courtesies must be adapted to cycling conditions. A question that is causing a great deal of agitation relates to the mode of greeting among wheelmen and wheelwomen. Shall a man take his hand from the handlebar at the risk of taking a header in order to tip his cap? Or shall he merely nod his head and say, howdy? Shall a lady make a sweeping courtesy or merely nod? Instances are cited wherein men have tried to do that which they have been taught from childhood, and the result has been a hectic flush all over one side of their faces, where the skin was caressed by the loving but somewhat calloused hand of Mother Earth. Ladies who have bowed too profoundly have been picked up tenderly by the helping hands after it was all over. It is with reason, therefore, that cyclists are giving this matter serious consideration. Bicycles really upended a lot of people's ideas about how to move around public space with courtesy and so on. And as you'll see, a whole regime of law had to be created to deal with cyclists. But back to wheelmen, they also promoted racing. They loved to race and race each other. Over in White River Junction, there's a famous image here from 1895 of the interstate race that was between New Hampshire and Vermont. And here's a little article from 1897 about a race that took place from Bellows Falls to Claremont and back. And it was sponsored by the Mount Kilburn Wheelmen. And according to the article, a good share of the village showed up accidentally. And it was about a 40-mile ride, and the winner came back in 2 hours and 9 minutes, which is an average of 20 miles an hour. So, a pause there to say they were very speedy, and speed was a huge thing. Now, you have to throw into the mix here that the bicycles probably didn't have gears. They may have had brakes. They didn't necessarily have brakes. The roads were terrible, so they're flying, and they're flying under very difficult circumstances. including this, a mishap took place when at the top of Dean Hill, about 5 miles this side of Claremont, on the return trip, Harry Grignon broke the rim of his wheel and rode 2 miles farther before meeting his cousin with whom he exchanged wheels. He then rode on to Charlestown, where he secured another mount and arrived third in the race in spite of the mishap. So there were huge, not just points of pride in these races, they would win prizes, money prizes, cameras, bike parts, things like that. And the newspapers loved to report on feats of endurance that cyclists had. So this is a story about 2 crack Woodstock wheelmen who left town in 1894 at 2:30 a.m. And their idea was they were going to ride to Littleton, New Hampshire, about 83 miles away. So they left at 2:30 in the morning to do that. Then they got there, and then they thought, well, let's keep going. We're having a good time. Let's keep going. So they go on to Woodsville. They stopped in St. Johnsbury. And after 158 miles in 23 hours, they took a short rest, slept for a few hours at night, and then they were about 52 miles from home. So this is just a couple of guys. We're like, hey, let's go for a bike ride. And they wanted to see how far they could go, what their bodies could do. So this occupies a lot of attention in the newspapers of the time. But there was an other out there, other with a capital O. And the early wheelmen were elites. And by the early 1890s, you started seeing middle-class aspirants and so on joining wheel clubs. But there were some people who were locked out, and a lot of these people were working class men. They didn't have the social capital to join a wheel club. And they were often called scorchers. And scorching was riding solely, like riding solo, not in a big group, not riding in an orderly fashion, often riding to get somewhere, doing it quickly. And scorching was considered to be quite a menace because it didn't fit people's ideas of appropriate riding. And this is an article that I think, it's from 1899. I think it begins in such a suggestive way. This is in Burlington. Another accident occurred Tuesday evening as a direct result of the ever-present bicycle scorcher. And it describes a situation where a guy who was a bike mechanic at this bike shop right here, which was Lane's bicycle livery, ran over an 8 or 9-year-old boy named Barney Buxton as he was scorching. That was the term they used for so-called furious riding or riding fast. And ran over poor Barney, and Barney was unconscious, and Dr. Lyman was called, and Barney recovered. But stories of scorching become a really prominent part of public discourse at the time. And there was this big moral concern about scorchers having gone too far. And there's a little funny tidbit I just discovered from the Free Press, Burlington Free Press in 1896. It's called Where He Belonged. They had a lot of little funny, they weren't news reports per se, but they were sort of humor things, and this is one of them. "What were you on earth?" queried St. Peter as the wheelman knocked at the gate. "I was a bicycle rider." "Did you ride fast?" asked the saint. "Fast?" repeated the cyclist. "I should say I did. No one could pass me on the road." "You were always riding like mad and colliding with other cyclists and running down pedestrians, weren't you?" "Yes, I was a scorcher," the cyclist admitted. "A scorcher, eh?" St. Peter repeated. "Well, there's no scorching here. You belong on the floor below." So, in order to fight the scourge of scorching, the wheelmen's clubs proposed to regulate bicycle riding. The Mount Kilburn Wheel Club here reports, "There has been considerable complaint of fast and reckless riding. It is better that the wheelmen take the matter in hand themselves." And they continue, "We suggest all wheelmen carry lanterns and bells and keep to the right side of the street or on such bicycle paths as may hereafter be provided." So basically they were saying to the town, we need an ordinance, we need a law, and we need to enforce it. The state of Vermont did pass a no sidewalk riding bill in the 1890s, but the towns were not finding that satisfactory. So most towns around the state between 1897 and 1898 started passing bicycle laws, and these are really the first traffic laws that small towns in Vermont have. The other thing to note about this is they refer to these bicycle paths. So there was this really interesting moment in American history between about 1896 and 1899 when there was a thing called the side path movement. And it was bicycle riders organizing to build side paths on the side of roads. And oftentimes there would be a toll, and you would have to pay a toll. But you could go huge, huge distances without being molested by carts and pedestrians and so on, because these side paths were built expressly for bicycles. In Vermont, we had some side paths, but not as many as you would have seen in New York or other states. There were other legal matters. According to this, it's next to impossible to safely steal a bicycle in Vermont. That is not true. Bicycle had the strongest laws in the country against bicycle stealing, including 2 years in state prison if you were caught stealing a bicycle. Here's an article about George Ashe, a bicycle thief who acquired a bicycle in White River Junction and then took it up to Chittenden County. According to the article, he got it from a college student, quote unquote. Now, I live in a college town, Burlington, and that's a classic bike thief thing. Oh, a college student gave it to me. More like you stole it from the college student. In any case, the bicycle back then was valued at $7, which would be about $190 today. And in this case, it wasn't a fancy bicycle, so he didn't get 2 years in prison. He got 3 months here in Rutland. So that's the Wheelmen. They were concerned about legal matters. They were concerned about etiquette. They were concerned about proving themselves to be athletic. And then there's the new woman. So we'll transition now to talk about women in bicycling. This is a fun little cartoon from the Londonderry Sifter in 1897. It's an image of this elegant young woman on a bicycle and a guy standing next to her. And it says this: "He, don't you think it rather risky to come this far alone on your wheel? She, hadn't thought of it, but if you feel timid, I'll see you home." This is the new woman on display, and that's a term that had emerged at the time. This is women demanding freedom of movement, demanding not to have chaperones in public, being independent and autonomous. And the bicycle was considered to be a great tool for that, to the point that prominent suffragists sort of adopted the bicycle. So I'm going to quote Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who wrote, "The bicycle will inspire women with more courage, self-respect, and self-reliance, and will make the next generation more vigorous of mind and body. For feeble mothers do not produce great statesmen, scientists, and scholars." So there were really strong symbolic and political ties between the suffrage movement and the bicycle, as well as the temperance movement. Here in Vermont, the suffragists never made any pronouncements about bicycles, as far as I can tell. However, the temperance movement here in Vermont loved bicycles because, as they said, you cannot drive drunk home alone on a bicycle, right? You'll fall off and hurt yourself. So the temperance movement thought that bicycles were good for healthy living. In the case of of women in bicycle riding, the newspapers were somewhere between celebrating it to resigned to it to somewhere in the middle of like, oh, it's just going to happen anyway. But they published a lot about women and bicycle riding in the 1890s. Like this little tidbit from the Free Press in Burlington in 1895. "The coming woman will be the woman whose mother rode a bicycle and thereby made herself fit to be the mother of the coming woman," says Ida Trafford Bell, who was a very prominent suffragist. And then it adds, "There are 8 million bachelors in the United States. Watch their reduction in number as soon as the bicycle girl in bloomers is scattered over the land," says the American Wheelman. So the early bicycling women were very concerned about restrictive clothing, and the bloomer is a good example of how they worked around the restrictions in clothing. And the bloomers sort of pantaloon kinds of things that are almost like a dress, but they give them a tremendous amount of freedom of movement. So the so-called rational clothing movement, which was the early sort of iteration of the suffrage movement, was especially concerned about bicycling clothing. Here's another tidbit. Those questions around etiquette became a concern as well with women riding bicycles. And here's a little tidbit from also the Burlington Free Press and 1895, and it's called Selecting a Cycle Teacher. Most cycle depots will send up a man to teach any of their own customers, and many ladies have learned in this fashion. Personally, however, it seems to me that if one must clutch any male thing wildly by the neck and fall into his arms 10 or 20 times in the course of an afternoon, a relative or intimate friend is better than an unknown oily mechanic. And I should therefore counsel any girl who contemplates learning the safety to select her teacher with these unavoidable contingencies in full view. And as I said, the suffrage movement in Vermont never made any public pronouncements about the bicycle. It was a complicated and formidable task they had here in Vermont to get the right to vote. But the suffrage movement prioritized women's control over their bodies. And in 1892, there was a conference that took place in Montpelier, the right of suffrage and the complete enfranchisement of women. And one of the major addresses there was called Physical Training for Women. And basically it says, it doesn't mention bicycling at all, but what it says is that a woman has a right to exercise, a woman has the right to fresh air, a woman has the right to her body. And that will advance women's suffrage because it creates more healthy women and more independence. And so here in Vermont, there was a certain ambivalence about that connection between suffrage and the bicycle. This is a little tidbit from the Orleans County Monitor. Miss Mayjune, do you believe in women's suffrage? Miss Janfeb, well, I haven't quite come to that yet, but I ride a bicycle. And so it was okay to ride a bicycle, but it wasn't necessarily okay for the suffragists to associate themselves with bicycles here. And so women did take to the bicycle eagerly. It was also a time when middle-class women, especially in bigger cities like Burlington, were becoming more publicly engaged and involved in, let's say, services for the poor, leading organizations that they had never led before. And the bicycle was seen as one sort of vehicle through which you could be publicly present and publicly engaged. But there were limits. There were some people who weren't really allowed to ride bicycles. So Montpelier's overseer of the poor was quoted basically as saying, in response to two women who received services from that organization seen on bicycles, he said, "It's okay for us to serve the poor. We do it with great pride. But a luxury item like a bicycle, they should not be associated with," right? The other dimension of the other gender dimension of the bicycle was there was a huge health debate that was happening related to the bicycle, and especially about women, their bodies, their sexual activities, and so on. And on the one hand, it was thought that the bicycle was a wonderful creator of good health. And so as this 1892 article says, the best RX is a ride. Take it instead of going to the druggist. And then what they called it was bicycle hygiene. Hygiene was a common expression for just sort of sanitary living. And here's an article from 1895 in the Burlington Free Press called Bicycling Hygiene. So bicycling was thought to open up the pores. Obviously that's sweat, we call it. And they said you should treat it with ablutions of water. So if you're getting sweaty, throw water on you. You should know how to breathe because breathing through the mouth can cause heart troubles. And be sure your mouth doesn't get parched. It can affect digestion. Drink milk with a few drops of rum in it before a ride. And so, and in fact, there was a University of Vermont medical professor who published and promoted the value of the bicycle for women's health. He thought it was a very good thing to prevent disease and to make people healthy. But there were other medical authorities who denounced bicycle riding quite vigorously. This is a very remarkable screed that was published in the Free Press in 1895. And it describes Dr. Heine Marks from St. Louis, who had been a former superintendent of their hospital. And he shares his denunciation of bicycling, as you will hear. He says, first you have a kind of paralysis of the hands and contraction of the chest. This causes congestion of the lungs and leads to consumption. I'll pause there to say that he's saying that it causes tuberculosis to ride a bicycle. Furthermore, with men, rupture, varicocele, hydrocele follow, and worst of all, it destroys virility. With women, riding promotes amorous desires. Married women are especially liable to very serious mishaps. If the world is not depopulated by the rapidly increasing membership of this suicide club, the human race will die out by reason of lack of manhood and inability to propagate. So there was a huge backlash in the medical community, and the pink comic here shows some of those bicycle diseases. One of my favorites is called, I'm going to forget that. One of my favorites is called bicycle face, and bicycle face was the contortions that your face were stuck in from the effort of balancing a bicycle or going too fast, of scorching, for example. Bicycle foot was another one which was thought to affect women in particular, especially because they wore fashionable French boots, and so it would destroy the ligaments, according to these threats. And then lastly, another really common one was bicycle hump, and it was this curvature of the spine of leaning over, and so there was a whole sort of cottage industry of medical professionals who were treating these things and warning women in particular. Bicycle face was a thinly veiled threat against women to not ride bicycles, right? Because it was a sort of medicalizing, I guess you could say, of an activity that was leading women to be without chaperones in public, to wear clothing that was quite different than people would accept, and so on. So the health controversies really raged throughout much of the 1890s. Okay, what about the roads? My last section. So the roads were terrible. The way we managed roads here in Vermont until the 1890s, even after the 1890s, into the early 1900s, the way we managed roads was the state legislature would sort of say, the local surveyor needs to pick up rocks off the roads, and they largely gave over control of how roads would be built and maintained to either toll companies or to the local select board. And the way you paid your taxes was to give time fixing the road. And so the roads were terrible. There was no consistency across from town to town. But Vermont we had what we call in history little republics. The towns were totally dominant over the state. And so road quality was inconsistent. And then when the railroads started coming in the 1840s, people basically abandoned road maintenance, and the heavy hauling and commodity hauling, that all went by rail. And so local travel was mostly by road. But by the 1890s, 1880s, it's a patchwork of about 13,000 miles of terrible, terrible roads. So wheelmen enter into this situation. There's an image here from 1894 of a wheelman on an undrained road, and you can sort of see how deep his tires go. So wheelmen were especially concerned from the get-go about how are they going to do this bike riding stuff. These are expensive bicycles. Where are we going to ride them? And there's one thing they did was they shared information amongst themselves. And this is a really remarkable example. It's a book called 10,000 Miles on a Bicycle by a guy named Carl Krohn. which was actually his nom de plume. His real name was Lyman Bagg, which I kind of like Lyman Bagg better. I think that's a great name. Anyway, in 1887, he publishes this really interesting book, it describes his travels throughout New England, including Vermont, the U.S. South, parts of Canada, and he describes what the roads are like, so that if you were a wheelman, you would get a hold of this book, and then if you wanted to go riding somewhere farther away from home, you would look at its description of the roads. So here, if anyone ever asks you this trivia question, now you know the answer, thanks to Carl Crone. He says, the longest day's ride previously taken in Vermont was on July 9th, 1883 by two Rutland boys, and it was 1.5 miles. The first century ride in Vermont was in 1883. And what he does, he goes on to describe the roads. From Bellows Falls to Windsor, 25 miles, I took the New Hampshire side of the Connecticut River and found some patches of sand. Thence to White River Junction, 15 miles, some fine stretches, some unrideable, blah, blah, blah. So you got your info about where is a good place to go riding from a book like this. And then an organization called the League of American Wheelmen, now known as the League of American Bicyclists, had been founded in 1880. They also published guidebooks. So there was a growing pressure among wheelmen to improve the road situation. And the solution that they came up with, they called it agitate, organize, and implement. And it was basically put pressure on the state to take over road management, to centralize it, take it away from the towns and give it to the state, give that power to the state. And there was a kind of undergirding vision of this, a civilizational vision that Albert Pope, who created the Columbia Bicycle Manufacturing Company, he became a big champion of good roads. For him, it was a business thing. If I can't sell bicycles because the roads are bad, let me fund the improvement of roads. So he funded the creation of the League of American Wheelmen and its Good Roads movement. And quoting him, he says, an eminent writer says, the road is that physical sign or symbol by which you will best understand any age or people. If they have no roads, they are savages, for the road is the creation of man and the type of civilized society. And he used his company, the bike company, Columbia Bicycle. He gave away many Columbia bicycles to people who would write essays about the importance of good roads. And so good roads agitation led to protest rides. People would organize rides where they would bring attention to the bad state of the roads, including this ride. This was just across the lake over in from us in Burlington, Ausable Chasm. There's a guy here dressed like a frog, and he's got a good roads message. And so everywhere they went, they were telling people, we've got to deal with the road problem. They did, the wheelmen had an ally in the agricultural sector. The Vermont Dairymen's Association was complaining about poor roads as early as the 1860s. But farmers themselves, the farmers' organizations were fine with wheelmen and joining the fight for good roads, but farmers themselves saw the wheelmen as elitists. Like, why would we improve the roads for these elitist bicycle riders? So it took some time for farmers to get on board. But the outcome of all that agitation was the Vermont Highway Act in 1892. And that's a real important shift. You might call it a watershed in Vermont history, also on some level national history, where Vermont passes a law that says we are going to take over centralized control over roads increasingly. And so it allows the towns to collect property taxes that are new, and then the state would distribute money back to the towns for special road projects. And it created a state highway commission that would kind of oversee all this. And the governor at the time was a guy named Levi Fuller. And Fuller was from Brattleboro. And if you remember early on, I talked about the Vermont Wheel Club. Well, Fuller was not a wheelman, but his whole political career was fighting for good roads. And so when he became governor, he made sure that this got passed. And it was because his brother-in-law, his father-in-law, all of his buddies were wheelmen, and they had wanted this, and they had put a lot of pressure on him to pass it. And on a national level, Vermont was only one of 6 states that passed so-called good roads legislation, which gave power to the state to basically take over road management. It wouldn't be until the 1920s, that the federal government would step in and demand good roads across the country. So Vermont was really way out ahead on this issue. And it's largely due to the wheelmen and their agitation. Now, by the 1900s, you start seeing other vehicles taking a place in our ecosystem of transportation. And so here's a little ad for a 4th of July parade in 1902 in Burlington. And it says, that there are going to be military vehicles, automobiles, bicycles, horribles, and trade parades. So for 20 years, bicycles were always at the heart of those 4th of July parades. They would bring in out hundreds of bicycle riders, but suddenly the automobile, in 1902, they were called locomobiles back then, is there. And you start seeing the automobile play a bigger role symbolically. Somebody named F.O. Stanley climbed Mount Washington in 1899 in a car. The Vermont Motor Company was established in 1902. Horatio Nelson Jackson, have any of you, do you know his story? He was a Burlington doctor who drove a car across the U.S. before anybody else. He made a bet. He was in San Francisco on vacation, and he was playing cards, and he made a bet that he could drive a car across the U.S. for $50. And he went out the next day and bought a little red car. It's now in the Smithsonian, and drove all the way to New York City. It took him months. He had to drive largely on train tracks. But he succeeded, so Burlington's role in automobile history is cemented. Burlington Automobile Club gets established in 1905. All those wheelmen, they joined the yacht club. Now they join the automobile club, right? That the automobile gives status. It's out of reach for most people, largely until the late 1920s. In 1910, there were like 300 automobiles registered in the whole state. By 1929, it's about 60,000 automobiles, right? So the automobile took a while, but it really does displace the bicycle as this sort of locus of excitement. And the bicycle goes from being this protagonist, this sort of celebrated object, this thing that at the forefront of everybody's mind, to now being a sort of a background thing. And then by the 1920s, it's a kid's toy. That's really when the bike industry stops trying to sell bikes to adults in the United States. And we start seeing stories in the papers about cars and bikes in conflict with each other. I won't go into any of these except to say that one of them says the typical Saturday night accident occurred on Williston Road when a car hit a bike, right? The newspapers no longer concerned about any of the excitement of the bike. Now they just start talking about how it's now in the way of the car. And that is my talk. And if you have any old photos in your attic, I'm always collecting old photos of bicycles. So if we have time, I'm happy to take questions, or whatever. I defer to the authorities of the Historical Society. I don't know exactly where, but M.J. Horton's. Does anyone? I haven't found an address for it.
Horton's was a department store.
Department store. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Downtown.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have an ad that I found of them, and they were selling Hartford bicycles and Columbia bicycles. So it probably wasn't the case that you had a dedicated bike shop here. But they were selling them probably in 3 or 4 different stores. So bicycles, I should just say this. A typical bicycle, a good bicycle, would cost about $75, $100, $125, which I mentioned earlier is in today's dollars is a lot of money. It's $2,000, $3,000, $3,500. That's a lot of money. So people had to save, and they had to be convinced. And so advertisers and stores got really creative with drawing people in. One of the things that they innovated that you still see today is they would sponsor races, right? Get people out, get people excited about the bicycle. So in Burlington, they had bike races quite a bit that were sponsored by all the sellers of bikes, the department stores, the electrical supply store. They all pitched in to generate excitement to help pay for the prizes of that race. Yeah.
Just sort of a comment. I think it's ironic. I own a bike store that's less than a quarter mile away, and I totally understand this idea of the League of American Wheelmen sort of improving our roads and making them better, and now there's sort of this rediscovery of rural roads and class 4 roads and dirt roads, and now it seems like the bike shop's intention should be to preserve the roads of the 1800s rather than to make them better and make them nicer. And it's just sort of funny how history does repeat itself, but it also sort of sometimes can be
it inverts things. Yeah, for sure.
And certainly that's a major reason why we can draw people from New York City and Montreal and Boston here, is because we have roads that have not been improved for 100 years.
Yeah, right.
And to pave them would be
Yeah. Well, I'll say that that impetus to create conditions, favorable bike riding conditions for out-of-staters, started in the 1880s.
Yeah.
And so if you owned a hotel in Vermont, you were very sensitive to could you attract bicycle riders for some good riding in your area. And hotels often sponsored Wheelmen's Days and with special rates and special banquets and so on to get them to come to the town. So the whole business community understood the importance of bicycles, primarily as a form of tourism, right? And it's interesting how today we continue to be in that mode of, obviously it's for ourselves too, but as an economic development strategy, some parts, especially in rural parts of the state, the Northeast Kingdom, you can just see the energy and investment happening up there around bicycles. And here in Western Vermont, I have seen evidence that this was a popular place for out-of-staters to come. Although there was A.N. Adams. Local historians, do you know who he is? A.N. Adams was a very prominent local historian in Fairhaven. And he was a vociferous complainer about the state of the roads here in Western Vermont. He said the state of the roads was just miserable. And he became, even though he was not a wheelman, he became a strong advocate for good roads in this part of the state. Yeah, history does repeat itself, but it often inverts things. Yeah.
What is the old sidecar? The 1910, 1915 sidecar? Was that motorized or was it pedal? Do you know what those were?
Slide car? Sidecar.
Sidecar. My grandmother was picked up by my grandfather to go get their marriage license.
Huh.
And when she came out and saw that he had a sidecar, she had second thoughts. And she, as my mother says, she made her decision, and it lasted her whole marriage. Not the sidecar. But I don't know if it was motorized or
It's a good question. What year was this?
1910 to 15.
It's quite possible that it was a pedal vehicle. So the bike industry, as I said, it was a big protagonist in the emergence of the automobile industry. And by the way, if you didn't know this, also the airplanes, like the Orville and Wilbur Wright were bike mechanics. They just took bike ideas and they put wings to them. Anyway, so early bicycle industry was really pushing towards automobiles. However, they didn't commit to automobiles. They were creating a lot of different interesting vehicles that had pedals or motors or both, that had 2 wheels, they had 3 wheels, they had 4 wheels. And they did it for a long time. In France, Peugeot was making what they basically velomobiles that had 4 wheels that were pedal until like the 1930s, right? So it took a while for the bike industry to really just dial in on what we know of today as the bike industry. And the bike industry right now, as you know, is really dynamic. There's all kinds of new things coming out. But the bike industry, one of the reasons we really got on that 2-wheel upright pedal instead of like recumbent, they made a lot of recumbent bikes in the 20s and teens and so on, is that the bike racing world was like, look, the recumbent bikes keep on winning. We need to lock in the right kind of bike here. And the industry decided that it would be the sit-up 2-wheeled pedal bike. And so we start seeing a real decline in the diversity of bicycle types after the 1920s and 30s. And it's kind of back. I mean, you're really starting to see 3-wheel bicycles and 4-wheel bicycles and cargo bikes and so on. But I don't know about the sidecar. Not for sure.
I've seen pictures of them
Yeah.
on the side of the bicycle.
There was a thing called the social bicycle, which was an interesting bike, and it was 2 bikes right next to each other with shared handlebars. In fact, I drew a picture of one in this one. It's called the Punnett Sociable Bicycle, page 5. Riding tandem, yeah. You know the song "A Bicycle Built for Two"?
Yeah.
That was a very popular song, and bicycles became the tool for courting. And in fact, another funny thing in this, so this one here is I found all these articles about how language was changing thanks to the bicycle, and a chaperone was called a pacemaker. That's on page 4. That was the slang for a chaperone. People reimagined all kinds of things through that bicycle excitement and lens, and language was just one of them. Yeah, one last question.
Sure, well, it's more a few comments. I thank you for the talk, very informative, and it gives me some ammo for the road, the car versus bicycle ever-present discussion.
Yeah.
But that, how the roads came about to a better bicycle situation. And now, after 100 years of the automobile, it's exciting to see a renewed interest, for not only people's health, but health
Yeah.
of Europe as well,
Yeah.
Because tens or hundreds of millions of automobiles is obviously taking its toll.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm glad to see, this happening.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting moment. It's what attracted my attention as an anthropologist is what's happening in cities that suddenly a city like New York City is investing very heavily in bicycle infrastructure. And for New York, it's because Paris is doing it and London's doing it. And one of the intriguing elements of New York is that about 15 years ago now, they started sending these traffic engineers down to Bogota, Colombia. That's why I ended up working in Bogota, because New York was inspired by what Bogota had done in basically a city with no resources, had turned into a world-class bicycle city where they had special lanes for bicycles, and they would close city streets on Sundays for hours so that people could just ride their bikes on city streets and so on. So New York was getting inspiration from a city that most people thought of as just a terrible murder capital of the world. But Bogota was really doing a lot in that. And so there's some really unlikely places that have invested in bicycles. And it's for lots of reasons, but one of them is people see it as a dignified way to get around. They see it as an active way to get around. They see it as a convenient way to get around instead of sitting in traffic in a car. And we're in a really interesting moment in Burlington. I'll just comment on that. That because of the pandemic, the streets are not totally empty by any stretch of automobiles, but we had decided, basically beginning in the 1920s in this country, we decided that cars are for roads, or roads are for cars. And we gave it over largely to that mode. And in Burlington, because there aren't as many cars, there's now a big discussion about, okay, well, there are other ways of using these roads. This is public space. It's precious. It's the only public space we got other than our parks. So should we rethink? Should we create space on the roads for bikes? So there's investment happening in bike lanes, and it's obviously very controversial. But it's a really interesting moment for the bike. So anyway, thank you all very, very much. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and
Thank you.
have a lovely afternoon.